The night was cold and silent at West Hollow Cemetery, the kind of silence that seeps into your bones. The wind howled through the worn-down tombstones, a ghostly whisper carrying secrets of the past. The only sound breaking the stillness was the rhythmic scrape of my shovel cutting into damp earth. I sighed, tossing another shovelful of dirt aside. My muscles ached, but I was used to it. After 25 years of digging graves, you stop complaining about sore arms and a bad back. The job was never easy, but to me, it was more than just work. It was solitude. It was a refuge. The dead never scared me. The living did. With bills piling up and loneliness pressing down on me night after night, I had accepted the inevitable. I needed extra cash. And in a place like West Hollow, where history ran deep and some things were best forgotten, I had learned that people would pay good money to keep their secrets buried. Tonight, I wasn't just digging a grave. I was erasing a story. This needs to disappear before sunrise. The man in the dark coat stood nearby, watching me closely. His voice was low, firm, the voice of someone used to giving orders. I glanced at the coffin beside the open grave. Simple, wooden, cheap, and small. Judging by the weight, whatever or whoever was inside big. No one can ever find this. Not now. Not ever. I didn't ask questions. I'd learned long ago that questions could be dangerous. But something about this night felt different. Something was off. When my shovel struck something solid, I knew the hole was deep enough. Exhaling, I looked up at the hooded man, waiting for the next command. Finish it. Now. I lifted the coffin and placed it into the grave, but the moment my hands touched the wood, a sharp chill shot up my arms. The coffin felt damp, cold. It was too cold, considering the night air was dry. Brushing away my unease, I began shoveling dirt back into the hole, covering the coffin inch by inch. It's done. Now pay me. The man smirked slightly, tossing an envelope at my feet. Don't worry. It's all taken care of. But I knew it wasn't. I walked back to my small cabin at the edge of the cemetery, my boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. The air felt different, thicker, heavier. The silence was unnatural, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. Then I heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. The sound came from beneath the ground. Holding my breath, I told myself it was just settling on earth, my mind playing tricks on me. Exhaustion makes me hear things. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone knocking on wood, from inside the coffin. A shiver crawled up my spine. I turned, my eyes locking onto the fresh grave. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying a strange scent, damp wood and rot. The man who had paid me was long gone, but something else was still there. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that it was over. Then came the whisper, low, raspy, crawling out from beneath the earth. You shouldn't have done that. My blood ran cold. I bolted for my cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it tight. But sleep didn't come that night, because the wind carried something strange. A whisper, a warning. I knew something had been buried that night, and I knew it had no intention of staying there. I barely slept. When exhaustion finally took me, my dreams were restless shadows moving beneath the earth, the knocking growing louder, the whisper repeating in my ears. You shouldn't have done that. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as the first rays of sunlight crept through my window. It was just a dream. At least that's what I told myself. I splashed cold water on my face, laced up my boots, and stepped outside. West Hollow Cemetery looked the same as it always had, quiet, still, peaceful. But something felt different. As I walked past the grave, my eyes were drawn to it, as if compelled by some unseen force. The dirt had settled. No signs of disturbance, no footprints, no broken earth. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. At the maintenance shed, I found Earl Grayson, the cemetery's groundskeeper, sipping coffee from a stained mug. Morning, Jim. You look like hell, Earl chuckled. I grunted. I didn't sleep much. Earl smirked. Don't tell me you're finally spooked by this place. I forced a dry laugh. Takes more than a few old bones to shake me. But Earl's smirk faded. He leaned against the workbench, lowering his voice. Something weird happened last night. My stomach tightened. Weird how? Earl rubbed his beard. I was doing a final sweep around midnight. Everything was normal until I passed near the willow trees. I didn't need to ask. That was right by the grave I had filled. I heard something, Jim. A sound I've never heard in all my years working here. My fingers curled into a fist. What sound? Earl met my eyes, his face unreadable. Knocking. I felt my throat dry. 3 soft knocks, coming from underground. A chill crept up my spine. At first I thought it was just settling earth, but then I heard it again, louder. I swallowed hard. You sure it wasn't an animal? Earl shook his head. No way in hell. It was deliberate, Jim, steady, like someone was trapped down there. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. My pulse pounded in my ears, and then Earl went on. I saw something. My jaw clenched. Saw what? Earl exhaled slowly, a figure, standing near the headstones, watching. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. When I shined my flashlight on it, there was nothing there. And that was only the beginning, because that night the knocking came again. But this time it wasn't just beneath the grave, it was beneath my cabin. And when the whisper came again, it wasn't just a voice, it was voices. Many of them. You let her out, she's not alone, and neither are you. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to the voices crawl through the walls, through the floor, through the night itself. And then came the knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps, tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, heart slamming against my ribs. The whisper stopped, and then let me in. I knew, deep in my bones, that I had made a terrible mistake. Because some things are meant to stay buried. And now they weren't. I gripped the arms of my chair so tightly, my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I stared at the door. Another knock. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The whispers had stopped, but the silence wasn't any better. It was thick, suffocating. Something waited on the other side of that door, and deep down, I knew that if I opened it, I wouldn't be closing it again. The floorboards beneath my feet creaked, a slow, deliberate sound. I wasn't alone. My body screamed for me to run, to throw open the back window and disappear into the night. But I couldn't, not yet. I had to know. Summoning what little courage I had left, I forced my hand toward the flashlight on the table, gripping it like a lifeline. My fingers trembled as I flicked it on and aimed it at the door. Nothing, just wood. But then the handle turned. A sharp breath caught in my throat. The latch rattled, slow and purposeful, as if whatever was outside was testing it. I backed away. My heart pounded so hard it was a wonder I didn't pass out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the rattling stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, flashlight trained on the door, waiting. Nothing. Finally, I found the courage to take a shaky step forward, then another. I reached out, fingers hovering over the deadbolt, and that's when I heard it. Not from the door, not from the window, from beneath me. A whisper, curling up from the floorboards, as cold as the grave. You already let me in. I jumped back like I'd been burned. My flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering to the floor. My breath hitched as the whisper turned into something else. A laugh, low, raspy, like someone choking on dirt. That was it. That was my breaking point. I bolted. I didn't stop grabbing my coat, didn't stop to check the door. I just ran, out the back into the night, into the cemetery itself, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Graves blurred past me, the moon casting long, twisting shadows over the stones. The wind howled through the trees, and in the distance, I swore I could hear footsteps. Not mine. Someone else's. No, not someone. Something. I needed help, and there was only one person who might have answers. Dr. Victor Holloway. I pounded on his door like a madman. It was nearly 4 a.m., but I didn't care. I could still hear the whispers in my head, feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. The door swung open. Holloway stood there, fully dressed as if he'd been expecting me. His gaze was calm. Too calm. They're awake, I gasped, shoving past him into the house. Holloway shut the door behind me, locking it. Tell me exactly what you saw. I tried to steady my breathing. Eleanor, she's out, but she's not alone. I saw him dead in the eye. I think I woke up the whole damn cemetery. His face darkened. He strode to a bookshelf, pulling down a thick, leather-bound book covered in dust. He flipped through it rapidly, his expression tight. You knew this would happen, didn't you? I said. My voice was sharper than I intended. Holloway didn't look up. I knew the risk, but I needed confirmation. I swore under my breath. Jesus, you used me. He turned a page, his finger pausing on an illustration. It was already set in motion. You just sped it up. I clenched my fists. How do we stop it? Holloway's fingers froze. His expression turned grim. We don't. A sick feeling twisted in my stomach. What the hell do you mean we don't? Holloway turned the book toward me. The illustration showed a burial ritual, one eerily similar to the ones I'd seen in the old cemetery records. A woman stood at the edge of a pit filled with bodies. Around her, figures knelt, not in prayer, in fear. In fear. My throat went dry as I read the text beneath it. She does not rise alone. She does not return to sleep. She only waits until more join her. I felt sick. You're saying this can't be undone? Holloway slowly closed the book. His face was unreadable. It was never about waking Eleanor. His gray eyes locked onto mine. It was about what comes after. A cold sweat formed on my brow. What comes after? Holloway exhaled. She isn't just a restless spirit, Jim. She's a beacon. My stomach twisted. A beacon for what? His voice dropped to a whisper. For everything else that was buried with her. My breath caught in my throat. The knocking at the door nearly made my heart stop. 3 slow taps. Tap, tap, tap. Holloway and I stared at the door. Neither of us moved. Then came the whisper. Let me in. But this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many. From the door, from the walls, from beneath the floorboards. I slowly turned to Holloway, my face pale. What do we do? He exhaled shakily. We pray they don't get inside. The candlelight flickered. The whispers grew louder. And the knocking didn't stop. The knocking didn't stop. It didn't grow louder. It didn't grow frantic. It just continued. Slow, patient. Tap, tap, tap. The whispers swirled around us, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling beneath the floorboards like fingers reaching for us. The air inside Holloway's house had turned thick, suffocating. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling dirt. Then the candle on the table flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink, because in that moment I felt them, not just outside the door, inside. A shape shifted in the blackness to my left, something small. A whisper tickled my ear, damp and cold. Let me in. I snapped. I lunged for the door, fumbling with the locks, desperate to get the hell out of there. But Holloway grabbed my arm, yanking me back just as the knocking stopped. A silence so deep it felt unnatural settled over the room. Then came the worst sound of all. A breath. Behind me. Cold. Close. Not mine. My body locked up, every muscle screaming at me to run. Then something touched my shoulder. I whirled around, my hands swinging wildly, but there was nothing. Just empty space. Holloway grabbed my arm again, his grip like iron. Don't open that door. I was shaking. Something's already in here, Holloway. His jaw tightened. I know, and that's when I saw it. Not a person. A shadow. It was stretched long against the far wall, twisted and unnatural. It shouldn't have been possible. There was no light source in the room anymore. But the shadow was still moving, and it wasn't ours. What the hell is that? My voice was barely a whisper. Holloway didn't answer, because the shadow lifted its head and looked at us. My stomach dropped. It had eyes. 2 pale, empty holes stared back at me, shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Then it did something I will never forget for as long as I live. It smiled. Not with a mouth, with its entire body. A jagged, twisting grin stretched across the wall, wide and unnatural, as if the shadow itself was bending in ways it shouldn't be able to. And then it lurched forward. The entire room plunged into chaos. The furniture shook. The walls groaned. The whispers screeched. The knocking started again, this time from the windows, the ceiling, the floors. Something slammed into the door from the outside. Hard. Bang, bang. Holloway shouted something, but I didn't hear him. I was too busy watching the shadow moving. It was crawling, dragging itself across the wall toward us. I grabbed the closest thing I could chair, a book, I don't even know, and hurled it at the wall. The second it hit, the shadow shrieked. Not a normal scream. A dozens of voices layered on top each other scream. The whole house shook. The knocking grew furious, and then everything stopped. Dead silence. The shadow was gone. The knocking, the whispers, gone. Holloway exhaled sharply. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, the candle flickered back to life. I turned to Holloway, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. What the hell was that? He looked grim. They're getting stronger. I swallowed hard. What do we do now? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to his desk, flipping open an old, weathered notebook. We don't have much time, Jim. His voice was eerily calm. Eleanor wasn't just buried. She was sealed away. And that seal? It's breaking. A cold weight settled in my chest. And when it breaks completely, Holloway's eyes met mine. Then the dead don't just whisper anymore. They scream. We didn't sleep. Instead, we spent the next few hours poring over Holloway's research. Old burial records, handwritten notes, ancient rituals scratched into yellow pages. All of them circled back to one thing. Eleanor Finch wasn't buried alone. I already knew that. I saw the others. But what I didn't know, what Holloway had just pieced together, was why. Eleanor wasn't just any woman. She was a healer, a midwife, someone the townspeople relied on for cures when their doctors failed. Until one day, a child she helped deliver died. The mother blamed Eleanor. The town followed. They called her a witch, and they buried her alive. But they didn't just bury her. They buried everyone who had sought her help. Men, women, children, an entire generation of people who had trusted her, sacrificed to silence whatever power they thought she had. And now she was calling them back. I closed the book, my hands trembling. So how do we stop it? Holloway hesitated. We can't stop it. I glared at him. Bullshit. There's always a way. His jaw clenched. Jim, listen to me. That grave you filled. That wasn't Eleanor's grave. That was the final piece of the seal. You didn't just bury something that night. He exhaled, his eyes dark. You unleashed it. I felt a sharp pang of nausea. Then we put it back. Holloway studied for a long time. Then, finally, he nodded. We have one chance, one night, and if we fail, Thorming. The house groaned. A new sound filled the air. Not knocking, not whispers, something worse. A shuffling, slow, uneven, like footsteps, from beneath the floor. My blood turned to ice. Holloway grabbed a rusty iron key from his desk and handed it to me. We need to go back to the cemetery, now. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice. Too late. The floorboard cracked. Something pushed upward. I grabbed Holloway and ran, because I knew, deep in my bones, something was coming through. And this time, it wasn't asking to be let in. It was forcing its way out. We ran, out the door, into the cold night, through the thick fog that clung to the cemetery like breath on a mirror. The whispers followed us, curling through the trees, slithering through the tombstones. Behind us, the house groaned. Wood snapped. Something was breaking through. Something was coming out. I didn't look back. Holloway led the way, moving fast despite his age, his grip tight on the iron key he had given me. We must get to the mausoleum. I had no idea what the hell was in the mausoleum, but if it meant getting away from whatever had been beneath his floor, I was all for it. The cemetery felt different now. The graves looked deeper, the tombstones are taller, the paths longer, twisting in ways they shouldn't, as if the entire place was shifting, rearranging itself like it knew what we were trying to do, like it didn't want us to leave. I kept moving, shoving away the thought. Then a child's laugh, high, hollow, too close. I whipped my head around, my flashlight beam slicing through the fog. Nothing. But I felt them, watching, waiting. The mausoleum came into view, a hulking stone structure in the oldest part of the graveyard. Ivy choked its sides, its doors rusted shut. But as we got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The doors were open, wide, inviting. Holloway skidded to a stop beside me, his breath visible in the freezing air. That's not good, he muttered. No kidding. I swallowed hard. What's in there, Holloway? His jaw clenched, the only thing strong enough to put them back. That was all I needed to hear. I took a step forward. Then the wind died. The whispers stopped, and I realized the night was completely, utterly silent. That's when I found out. We weren't alone. Something moved behind us. I turned slowly. A woman stood at the edge of the gravestones, barely visible in the fog. Eleanor Finch. Her head tilted to an unnatural angle, damp hair clinging to her face, her dress hanging in wet, tattered strips. Her eyes, pale, empty, locked onto mine. She smiled. Then from the darkness behind her, others emerged. Not just one. Dozens. Figures in burial clothes rotted beyond recognition. Some are still wearing blindfolds, some with their hands bound in rusted chains, some missing eyes, fingers, whole sections of flesh. The forgotten, the buried. And they were all looking at us. Run, Holloway whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We raced into the mausoleum, feet pounding against cold stone. I grabbed the heavy doors and slammed them shut behind us, shoving my weight against them. Holloway pulled a rusted iron rod from a nearby alcove and jammed it through the door handles. Outside, the whispers returned. Soft, persistent. Let us in. I turned to Holloway. Now what? He grabbed my wrist, yanking me deeper into the mausoleum. The vault. We moved fast, winding through the tight stone corridors, past rows of ancient tombs stacked in the walls. The deeper we went, the colder it got. My breath fogged out in front of me, my skin prickling with something wrong. Then we reached it. A heavy iron door, its surface covered in deep, intricate carvings, old symbols, warnings. Holloway fumbled with the key. His hands were shaking. Behind us, the whispers grew louder. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The hallway behind us was empty, but I could feel them, watching, waiting. The key jammed into the lock. The iron door screeched open, and then we heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking, not from behind, from inside the vault. My stomach turned to ice. Holloway exhaled. It's still here. I had no idea what it was, but if it was on our side, I wasn't about to complain. He stepped inside. I followed. The room was small, cold. The air is thick with dust and something else ancient. At the center stood a single stone coffin. Holloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and jammed it into the lid. I stepped back. Wait, we're opening that. Holloway gritted his teeth, forcing the stone lid upward. This is the only thing that can stop her. The lid slid back, and my breath caught in my throat, because inside the coffin was not a body. It was chains. Thick, rusted iron chains coiled together, their ends broken as if something had already escaped. My stomach dropped. Holloway's. The whisper stopped. A voice spoke. Not from outside, not from the coffin, from everywhere. You're too late. The vault shook. A deep, horrible rumbling sound echoed through the stone, dust raining from the ceiling. And then, the iron door began to close. Holloway's eyes went wide. Jim, move. I lunged forward, but the door slammed shut. We were trapped. I spun to Holloway. What the hell just happened? His face was pale. We were wrong. I shook my head. About what? Holloway turned slowly toward the stone coffin, his expression grim. This wasn't built to keep Eleanor in. The air turned into ice. The candles flickered. And from the darkness of the coffin, something laughed. Low. Hungry. I stepped back, heart hammering. Then what the hell was it for? Holloway swallowed hard. To keep something else locked away. My stomach twisted. And then from inside the coffin something moved. A hand, blackened and skeletal, slowly rose from the coils of broken chains. Fingers flexed. A voice like cracking bone filled the vault. She woke me up. The fingers curled. Now let's wake up. The candles died. The vault plunged into darkness, and we were not alone. Darkness swallowed us whole. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then the hand jerked forward. I dove back. Holloway wasn't fast enough. The skeletal fingers clamped around his wrist. He let out a strangled gasp, his whole body seizing up like he'd been electrocuted. Then came the sound, a deep, wet cracking as his flesh began to rot beneath its grip. Holloway. I lunged, grabbing his shoulder, trying to pull him away. But his skin was turning gray. His veins are black. And the thing in the coffin just laughed, a dry, brittle sound like wind through dead trees. You should have left me buried. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed the crowbar Holloway had dropped and swung it down with everything I had, slamming it against the thing's wrist. It screeched. The grip loosened just enough for Holloway to stumble freely. He collapsed to the ground, clutching his arm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I barely had time to process what had happened before the coffin exploded. Not literally, but shadows erupted from it, thick, writhing tendrils of black smoke, moving like living things. They slithered across the ceiling, spilling out of the coffin, filling the vault. And then I saw it. The thing inside. It wasn't just a corpse. It wasn't even a person anymore. It was something old, something wrong. A husk of what had once been a man, its skin burned black, its mouth stretched too wide in a grin full of jagged teeth. It had no eyes, just empty sockets, hollow and hungry, and it was still laughing. Eleanor broke the seal. It cocked its head, bones cracking. You came here to stop her. But she was never the real danger. The shadows tightened around us. Something moved in them. Many things. I reached for Holloway, trying to yank him to his feet, but his legs gave out. His face was pale, sweat beading along his forehead. The thing in the coffin lifted one skeletal finger and pointed at him. He's already mine. I lost it. I grabbed the crowbar and swung it straight for its head. But before I could connect, it disappeared. The shadows collapsed inward, swallowing it whole. And suddenly, the vault was empty. Silent. Except for Holloway's ragged breathing. I dropped to my knees beside him. Holloway, talk to me. His skin was still turning gray. His veins are black. His breath came in short, pained gasps. It's not just Eleanor. Jim, I swallowed hard. I know, his grip on my arm tightened, his fingers felt ice cold. It was never about letting her out. His voice was barely above a whisper now. It was about letting him out. A chill crawled up my spine. Who? Holloway's gaze locked onto mine. The one they buried her with. The one they were afraid of. And then the shadows stirred. I turned, and Eleanor was standing in the doorway, but this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, shapes loomed in the darkness. Tall, twisted, wrong. The forgotten dead, the ones the town had buried with her, their eyes, empty, pale, endless, locked onto me. Then Eleanor raised his hand, and they rushed forward. We ran. Holloway was barely able to move, but adrenaline pushed him forward. I practically dragged him through the winding stone corridors of the mausoleum, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dead followed. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear them. Bones cracking, feet dragging, voices whispering. You let us out. The mausoleum twisted around us, the walls stretching, the halls longer than they should have been. The cemetery was warping. The dead were reshaping it. Then, light. The exit. We stumbled toward it, our lungs burning, the cold air like knives against my skin. The second we burst outside, I threw Holloway to the ground and spun around. But the dead didn't follow. They stopped at the threshold, just inside the mausoleum. Watching. Waiting. Eleanor smiled. Then slowly, deliberately, she stepped back into the darkness. The doors swung shut on their own, and the cemetery was silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep. Neither did Holloway. We spent the rest of the night barricaded inside his house, the lights on, a shotgun on the table between us. By morning he looked worse. His skin was ashen, his hands trembled. The infection, whatever it was spreading. I poured him a drink, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. They're not done, Jim. His voice was hoarse. They won't stop now. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already knew. We had let something out. And now, West Hollow Cemetery wasn't just haunted, it was awake. Holloway took a long sip of whiskey, staring at nothing. This town doesn't know what's coming. I exhaled. Then we stopped it. His eyes flicked to mine. We can't. A shadow passed over the window. I turned my head just in time to see someone standing at the edge of the cemetery. Tall, thin, dressed in black. They weren't there a second ago. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched. I swallowed hard. Then what do we do? Holloway set his glass down with a quiet thud. He didn't look at me when he spoke. We get the hell out of town. A pause. Then 3 soft knocks at the door. Tap, 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 tap. We froze. The whispers returned. Too late. The wind howled. The candles flickered. And the knocking didn't stop. The knocking didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Slow. Patient. Waiting. Holloway and I didn't move. We barely even breathed. Then the doorknob turned. I grabbed the shotgun from the table, aiming it at the door while shaking hands. Holloway reached for his whiskey but missed, knocking the glass onto the floor. It shattered against the wood, but neither of us flinched. We were too busy listening. The wind outside had died. The whispers were gone. But that meant only one thing. Whatever was outside wasn't whispering anymore. It was here. Watching. Listening. Waiting for us to make the next move. Holloway exhaled. His voice barely above a whisper. Don't open it, as if I needed the reminder. Then, the knocking changed. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was at the windows, the walls, the ceiling. A dozen hands, 100, all knocking in perfect unison. Tap, tap, tap. I felt sick. Holloway's face had gone gray. He pressed his palm against his chest like he was struggling to breathe. They're inside the walls. The knocking grew louder, faster. The house shook. Then, from somewhere deep inside, a voice. Not Eleanor's. His. The thing we had let out. You should have left me buried. The temperature dropped. Frost crawled along the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. And then, everything went silent. No knocking, no whispers, just stillness. Like the calm before a storm. I swallowed hard. Holloway? He didn't answer. I turned, and he was gone. I don't remember how long I stood there. A shotgun gripped tight, heart pounding in my ears. Minutes? Hours? It felt like forever. Then, from the darkness, a whisper. Jim, I froze. It was Holloway's voice, but wrong. Distorted, like something was trying to speak through him. A cold sweat dripped down my back. I turned slowly. The shadows moved. A shape, tall, thin, wrong, unfolded from the corner of the room, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It wasn't Holloway, but it wore his face. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes empty. It smiled, and then it lunged. I don't remember pulling the trigger, but the shotgun went off. The blast lit up the room for a split second, just long enough for me to see the thing's mouth opening wider than it should. Then, darkness again. The room was filled with screeching, not just from it, from everywhere. The walls screamed, the floor screamed, the night itself screamed. I ran, out the back into the cemetery, my boots crunching against frozen grass. The fog had thickened, curling through the tombstones like it was alive. Something moved in it, many things. The dead, awake, watching, and waiting for me. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out. And then I saw him, Holloway, standing at the edge of the cemetery, still. Too still. His back was to me, his shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. I swallowed hard. Holloway? He didn't turn, didn't move. I took a step forward, then another. And that's when I saw his hands, hanging at his sides, fingers twitching, veins black as ink. Something had gotten to him. Something had taken hold. "Jim," he said again. His voice was flat, empty, wrong. I took a step back. His head snapped to the side, bones cracking. He's awake now. The wind roared, the cemetery shook, and behind Holloway from the fog, they came. Eleanor, the others, the forgotten dead, and standing in front of them all, him. The thing from the coffin. It was smiling. I did the only thing I could. I ran through the trees, through the dark, back to my cabin. The cemetery wasn't just haunted anymore. It was his. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Outside, silence. I waited. Minutes passed, then hours, but they never came. They didn't have to, because something had changed. West Hollow Cemetery wasn't just a graveyard anymore. It was awake. And I knew, deep in my bones, I had already lost. Because the dead weren't going to stay buried. Not ever again. And no matter what I did, no matter how far I ran, they were coming for me. They were coming for everyone. I didn't leave my cabin for 3 days. Not after what happened in the cemetery. Not after seeing Holloway changed. I barely slept, barely ate. I just sat there, shotgun in my lap, staring at the door, waiting. Waiting for the knocking to start again. Waiting for the whispers to slip through the cracks. Waiting for him to come back. But they never did. And somehow, that was worse. On the 4th day, I finally stepped outside. The air smelled wrong, like damp earth and something rotting. The cemetery stretched before me, looking the same as it always had. But it wasn't. I could feel it. The graves were deeper. The headstones are taller. The fog was thicker, curling between the trees like it was watching me. And somewhere, out there in the mist, they were waiting. Holloway was gone. His house was empty. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Just gone. Like he had never been there at all. But I knew better. I had seen him. I had seen what he had become. And I knew, deep down, I would see him again. Not as the man he was, but as something else. I should have left. I should have packed my truck and never looked back. But I didn't. Because some sick part of me needed answers, needed to know what I had left out, needed to know if there was still a way to put it back. So that night, I did something I knew I would regret. I went back to the cemetery. Alone. The fog swallowed me whole as I moved between the tombstones. The air was thick, suffocating. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. Then, the whisper started, soft, faint, crawling through the trees. "Jim?" I gritted my teeth and kept walking. I wasn't here to listen. I was here to end this. I reached the mausoleum. The doors were still closed, still locked, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the rusted iron key from my pocket and slid it into the lock. The second it turned, everything changed. The whispers stopped, the wind died, and from somewhere behind me, a single, deliberate knock. Tap, tap, tap. My body locked up, the cold seeped into my bones. Slowly I turned, and I wasn't alone. They stood between the graves, silent, watching, the forgotten dead. Some are still wrapped in burial cloths, some in tattered rags, some with faces I recognized. Holloway was among them. His skin was ashen, his veins were black. But his eyes weren't empty anymore. They were full, with something old, something hungry. "You shouldn't have come back." His voice was hollow. I swallowed hard. "What are you?" His lips curled into a smile, and from the fog, a figure stepped forward. Tall, thin, dressed in black. Him, the thing from the coffin, the thing I had left out. He stopped just a few feet away, tilting his head like he was studying me. Then he smiled. A wide, unnatural grin. And at that moment I understood. It was never about Eleanor. It was never about revenge. It was never about the curse. It was about me. I had dug the grave. I had put the coffin in the ground. I had broken the seal, and now I belonged to him. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to my cabin, don't remember slamming the door shut, locking it behind me. All I remember is silence. The way the wind stopped, the way the whispers faded, and the way just before dawn, I heard one last knock, soft, almost gentle, tap, 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 and a whisper, "Not yet." I don't know what that means. I don't know why they didn't take me. But I do know one thing. West Hollow Cemetery isn't haunted anymore, because ghosts haunt places. This is something worse, something I don't think can be stopped. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, he'll come back for me. Because I dug into the grave, I put the coffin in the ground, and now I belong to the dead. The end.